The most expensive mistake in aviation is assuming you know who someone is before they ever speak a word. On a quiet Monday morning at a major U.S. international airport, Terminal C's VIP boarding lounge felt unusually still, as if the air itself was waiting. Passengers in tailored suits and polished shoes moved with practiced confidence, unaware that one seat assignment would soon shift the entire balance of authority. Marcus Carter walked through the corridor alone, dressed in a simple navy sweater and dark jeans, carrying nothing that suggested the weight of his position. He did not move like someone trying to prove anything. He moved like someone who already knew the outcome before the conversation began. At the VIP boarding counter, a flight attendant named Nicole Harris looked up from her tablet and paused just long enough to make a decision she would later regret. Behind her, Captain David Reeves reviewed the passenger manifest, his expression tightening as he confirmed what he thought was a simple seat change. That assumption was incorrect. Marcus stopped at the edge of the lounge and calmly stated that his seat had already been assigned and verified. Nicole's tone stayed firm, but the subtle shift in her posture revealed she was no longer responding to information, only to appearance. Within moments, the situation was being framed not as a question of accuracy, but as a question of compliance. A white VIP passenger nearby, Charles Whitmore, leaned back in his seat as if the outcome had already been decided in his favor. Mia Collins, a junior crew trainee, quietly checked the system log on her handheld device and noticed something that did not align with what she was being told. She hesitated for a moment, realizing that speaking up would not just challenge a person, but challenge the structure she worked under. Marcus finally turned slightly, his voice calm, and said he would remain in his seat until the matter was properly verified. The cabin felt still, not because nothing was happening, but because every movement now carried consequence. Some passengers began exchanging glances, sensing that what they were witnessing was not routine protocol. Nicole maintained her stance, but her confidence was now supported more by hierarchy than certainty. Marcus reached into his pocket and tapped a single command into his secure device. At that exact moment, an unseen system began to register his authorization across multiple internal channels. Mia looked up again, realizing this was no longer about a seat, but about control. The atmosphere inside the cabin shifted in a way that no announcement could explain. Marcus exhaled slowly, as if confirming a decision that had already been made long before boarding. Then Marcus looked toward the front of the cabin, where authority was still being enforced based on assumption rather than fact. And in that quiet moment it became clear that every system built on certainty without verification eventually reveals its own fragility when confronted by truth in real time. Now, the moment Marcus Carter initiated the secure command, nothing visibly changed in the cabin. But beneath the surface of the airline's internal network, verification protocols began silently, aligning passenger identity records with corporate authorization systems. On the outside, the VIP boarding lounge still looked orderly, with passengers unaware that a hidden layer of validation had just been activated. Nicole Harris maintained her position at the counter, her attention fixed on procedure, though her confidence now carried a sharper edge, as if holding on to authority required more effort than before. Captain David Reeves stepped closer to the manifest display, scanning lines of passenger data that no longer appeared as straightforward as they had minutes earlier. A small discrepancy flagged in the system history showed that Marcus Carter's seat assignment had been accessed and modified shortly before boarding, though the reason was not immediately visible in the standard interface. Meanwhile, Charles Whitmore remained seated in the VIP area, visibly relaxed, assuming that the situation would resolve in his favor as similar situations often had in his experience. Mia Collins, still positioned slightly behind the main counter, quietly reopened the internal log feed on her handheld device, her eyes narrowing as she traced the sequence of changes. The entry for Marcus Carter was no longer just a reservation line. It was now marked with layered system notes indicating multiple overrides, each requiring higher authorization than standard staff permissions. She hesitated, then glanced toward Nicole, sensing that what she was seeing was not being acknowledged intentionally. Nicole, noticing Mia's focus, immediately redirected her attention and instructed her to remain focused on passenger flow rather than internal diagnostics, reinforcing the expectation of procedural silence. Marcus stood a few steps away from the seating area, observing without urgency, his presence steady in a way that contrasted with the growing tension around him. A nearby passenger attempted to ask a question about the delay, but the response from staff was brief and controlled, redirecting attention away from the situation. The atmosphere in the lounge subtly shifted as more passengers began to notice that communication between crew members had become less fluid, with brief pauses replacing confident instructions. Captain Reeves requested a secondary verification through the central system terminal, and what returned was not a denial, but an incomplete authorization trail that suggested administrative interference rather than passenger error. Nicole insisted that protocol supported her decision, but her tone now carried an undertone of uncertainty that she worked hard to conceal. Mia quietly forwarded a system snapshot to a secure internal channel reserved for supervisory review, aware that she had crossed a threshold that could not be reversed. Marcus finally adjusted his position slightly, looking toward the gate entrance where boarding announcements had temporarily paused. The silence was no longer neutral. It had become expectant. Every individual in the lounge, whether staff or passenger, now seemed to sense that the situation was no longer about seating allocation, but about the validity of the system itself. And as the internal verification loop continued running in the background, the structure that had once felt absolute began to reveal the first signs of instability under its own scrutiny now. As the internal verification process continued running across the airline's secured network, subtle changes began to appear on secondary displays that were not normally visible to frontline staff. Flight operations data, passenger authentication logs, and seat control permissions were quietly being cross-checked against higher-level corporate records. In the VIP boarding lounge, the atmosphere remained visually unchanged, but the behavior of the staff had already begun to shift in small, noticeable ways. Nicole Harris noticed that her access panel briefly refreshed without input, resetting portions of the seating control interface she had been using moments earlier. Captain David Reeves, now visibly focused, attempted to regain manual confirmation through a separate terminal, but the response delay indicated that the system was prioritizing an external audit channel over local command input. Mia Collins, still holding her device, observed that Marcus Carter's record had expanded again, now displaying a layered authorization structure that included executive oversight tags and real-time audit activation status. She did not fully understand what she was seeing, but she understood enough to recognize that this was beyond routine verification. Charles Whitmore, still seated in the VIP section, began to show subtle signs of discomfort as he noticed staff conversation becoming quieter and more fragmented, replaced by short confirmations instead of full explanations. Marcus remained where he stood, his posture unchanged, his attention not on the staff, but on the system activity unfolding indirectly around him. A notification briefly appeared on a nearby operations monitor indicating that an internal compliance review had been initiated, but it disappeared almost immediately as the interface shifted to restricted visibility mode. Nicole attempted to reassert control by instructing boarding staff to continue normal procedure, but her voice no longer carried the same certainty it had earlier, and a few of the standard acknowledgments from crew members were delayed or incomplete. Captain Reeves then received a direct message alert requiring confirmation of passenger authorization through corporate compliance clearance rather than flight deck approval, a protocol he had not triggered himself. At that moment, Mia quietly stepped closer to the counter and stated that the system logs were no longer matching the physical actions being taken at the gate, her voice careful but firm. Nicole turned toward her with immediate resistance, instructing her once again to remain focused on assigned duties, but the interruption had already drawn attention from nearby passengers. Marcus finally shifted his gaze toward the central boarding display, where his name briefly appeared, disappeared, and then reappeared with an updated status indicator marked as under executive validation review. The change was subtle, but it caused a visible pause in the behavior of the boarding process itself. Even the ambient announcements seemed to hesitate, as if waiting for confirmation before continuing. A member of the ground operations team approached Captain Reeves and quietly informed him that the boarding authorization for this section was now partially controlled by an external corporate audit feed, though the reason had not yet been disclosed to the gate-level staff. The statement caused a brief silence among the crew, not from confusion alone, but from the realization that control was no longer fully localized. Marcus remained still, allowing the process to unfold without intervention, as if the system itself was now completing a sequence already set in motion before any of them arrived at the gate. And in that growing uncertainty, the boundary between assumed authority and actual authority began to shift in real time, no longer defined by personnel on the ground, but by the unseen verification layers now taking precedence over every decision being made in the lounge now, as the boarding lounge transitioned deeper into system-level validation. The separation between ground control authority and corporate-level authorization became increasingly visible through small but undeniable operational disruptions. Flight announcements that once flowed in a consistent rhythm were now punctuated by brief pauses, as if each message required silent approval before release. Nicole Harris stood near the boarding counter, her posture increasingly rigid as she attempted to maintain procedural control, but the feedback she was receiving from her terminal no longer matched her inputs in real time. Each attempt to confirm passenger clearance for the VIP section returned with delayed responses, suggesting that the verification layer was now prioritizing external audit authority over local command structure. Captain David Reeves moved between terminals, attempting to isolate the source of the discrepancy, but every access point he used now redirected him to a restricted compliance interface that required authorization beyond his operational level. Mia Collins remained at her position slightly behind the main desk, her attention fixed on the evolving system logs that continued to update without manual input from staff. She noticed that Marcus Carter's record was no longer being treated as a standard passenger entry, but as an active governance case under live review status. That designation carried implications she did not fully understand, but she understood enough to recognize that it placed all current staff decisions under retrospective evaluation. Charles Whitmore, still seated in the VIP area, began to show visible discomfort as boarding delays increased and crew communication became less confident. Conversations that were once direct instructions had shifted into fragmented exchanges, with staff confirming information rather than issuing it. Marcus Carter remained calm and stationary, his presence unchanged despite the increasing tension surrounding the gate. He observed the environment not as a participant reacting to instability, but as someone watching a process unfold according to parameters already established before escalation began. A new alert briefly appeared on the central operations screen indicating that the current boarding sequence had been flagged for executive compliance verification, and that all actions within the zone would be recorded for audit reconstruction. The message disappeared quickly, replaced by a restricted interface that only displayed limited operational permissions. Nicole attempted to escalate her override request through standard channels, but her access was now met with a notification indicating that temporary suspension of local authority had been applied pending review. That confirmation caused a subtle but noticeable shift in her demeanor, as the certainty behind her earlier decisions began to erode. Captain Reeves received a direct communication requiring acknowledgement of corporate governance activation, a protocol that effectively placed the entire boarding process under external authority review until further notice. Mia finally spoke again, carefully noting that the system was no longer simply verifying identity, but actively reconstructing the sequence of decisions made since Marcus Carter entered the lounge. Her statement was not challenged immediately, because the data visible on secondary screens appeared to support her observation. Marcus turned slightly toward the boarding gate display, where his status had now stabilized under a unified executive clearance indicator, replacing all previous conflicting entries. The lounge fell into a controlled silence, not enforced by staff, but created by uncertainty itself, as every action now required validation from a system no longer responding solely to human input. And within that silence, it became increasingly clear that the structure they had relied upon for authority was no longer operating under local control, but under a higher layer of oversight that had already begun evaluating every decision in real time. Now the boarding lounge had entered a state where time itself felt delayed, as if every second required confirmation before it could fully exist within the system. The restricted compliance interface that had taken over the primary operations terminal now displayed a continuously updating audit sequence, silently documenting every action taken since Marcus Carter first entered the VIP boarding area. Nicole Harris stood motionless for a moment, her hands no longer actively engaging with the control panel. As the system responses she depended on continued to override her inputs without direct acknowledgement. Captain David Reeves attempted to regain local authority through a backup terminal, but each access attempt now returned a standardized message indicating that operational control had been partially transferred to corporate compliance oversight pending active review. Mia Collins watched the data stream on her handheld device with increasing clarity, realizing that the system was no longer reacting to individual commands, but reconstructing the entire sequence of events as a single evaluated timeline. Every scanned boarding pass, every manual override attempt, and every communication between staff members was being compiled into a structured audit record that appeared to prioritize sequence accuracy over human interpretation. Charles Whitmore, still seated in the VIP area, had stopped interacting with his surroundings entirely, now observing the subtle shift in atmosphere as boarding procedures remained suspended without explanation. Marcus Carter remained in place, his posture unchanged, as if the disruption unfolding around him had already been accounted for long before it became visible to others. The display near the gate updated again, briefly showing a full system notification indicating that executive-level validation had transitioned into active review enforcement, meaning that no further manual overrides would be accepted until resolution. Nicole finally attempted to speak to ground operations directly through a secured channel, but the response she received was no longer from a local coordinator. It was an automated compliance acknowledgement confirming that her current authorization level was under temporary suspension. That confirmation created a visible pause in her behavior, as the structure supporting her decision-making had effectively been removed without physical intervention. Captain Reeves stepped back slightly from the terminal, recognizing that continued attempts to override the system would only generate additional audit flags rather than resolve the situation. Mia, now more confident in her interpretation of the logs, quietly stated that the system was not only recording the present moment, but actively cross-referencing prior authorization patterns tied to the passenger record in question. That observation shifted the focus of attention among the crew, as it suggested that the review was not isolated to this single incident, but connected to broader operational history. Marcus turned his attention briefly toward the boarding gate display again, where his status remained locked under executive verification protocol, now accompanied by a secondary indicator confirming live governance oversight from corporate headquarters. The atmosphere within the lounge had transitioned from procedural uncertainty to structural reevaluation, as if every role within the space was being reassessed in relation to a system that no longer distinguished between assumption and verified authority. Nicole lowered her gaze toward the terminal, no longer attempting further input, while Captain Reeves maintained distance from the primary controls, acknowledging through silence that the situation was now outside conventional operational management. And within this evolving framework, it became increasingly evident that the outcome was no longer being determined by those physically present at the gate, but by a parallel authority layer that had already begun rendering its judgment through continuous system-level analysis. Now the compliance framework had now shifted from passive monitoring into active governance execution, where every recorded event within the boarding lounge was being continuously reprocessed as part of a live decision. Architecture. The system interface at the gate no longer functioned as a simple operational tool, but as a centralized validation engine that synchronized passenger identity data with corporate authorization layers in real time. Nicole Harris remained near the primary boarding counter, her hands resting above the terminal without input, as each attempt to re-establish manual control resulted in automatic rejection, messages indicating that local permissions were no longer sufficient to override current protocol status. Captain David Reeves stood slightly behind her, observing the same pattern repeat across secondary terminals, each one displaying restricted access indicators that confirmed a temporary suspension of ground-level authority until audit completion. Mia Collins, still positioned at the edge of the control zone, continued reviewing the evolving log sequence, now noticing that the system had begun categorizing actions not only by timestamp, but also by decision influence weight. assigning hierarchical significance to each interaction based on authorization sensitivity. This level of analysis was far beyond standard boarding procedure and indicated that the system was reconstructing intent as well as action. Charles Whitmore remained seated in the VIP area, no longer interacting with staff, his attention shifting toward the overhead display as it intermittently refreshed with compliance status indicators that were not previously visible to passengers. Marcus Carter remained stationary within the same physical position, yet the environment around him continued to reorganize in response to system-level interpretation rather than human instruction. A new notification appeared across the primary operations screen confirming that executive governance synchronization had been fully engaged, meaning that all operational decisions within the current zone would be evaluated against corporate oversight criteria before execution approval. Nicole attempted once more to initiate a procedural override through emergency ground communication channels, but the response returned as a standardized governance law confirmation, stating that all local commands were now subject to deferred validation. That message effectively removed any remaining ambiguity regarding her operational authority. Captain Reeves exhaled slowly, stepping away from the terminal as he recognized that further intervention would only increase audit complexity without altering the current state of control. Mia quietly noted that the system was now actively correlating Marcus Carter's identity entry with multiple internal governance records, each one requiring elevated clearance to access, suggesting that the review process was expanding beyond the immediate incident into broader organizational oversight territory. At that moment, the boarding display updated again, showing a synchronized status alignment across all connected systems indicating that passenger level verification had escalated into executive-level governance review with full audit trace enabled. The atmosphere in the lounge shifted further into controlled stillness, not due to instruction, but due to the realization that every action was now being observed through a framework that evaluated consequences before allowing continuation. Nicole lowered her gaze toward the terminal, no longer attempting further interaction, while Captain Reeves maintained distance from all control interfaces, acknowledging that the structure he once managed had transitioned into a higher authority model operating independently of ground input. Marcus Carter remained composed, his attention fixed forward, as the system continued processing layers of verification that now extended beyond the visible environment into institutional oversight channels that were actively compiling a complete decision history of the entire sequence. Now at this stage, the governance-level audit had fully transitioned into an active decision processing cycle, where every recorded interaction inside the boarding lounge was being continuously evaluated against corporate compliance architecture and historical authorization benchmarks. The system no longer functioned as a passive recorder of events, but as an independent validation structure that interpreted sequence, intent, and procedural alignment in parallel. Nicole Harris stood near the boarding interface with minimal movement, her attention fixed on a terminal that no longer responded to standard input pathways, as every command she attempted was rerouted into a suspended authorization queue. Captain David Reeves remained slightly behind her, his focus divided between multiple terminals that now displayed synchronized governance restriction messages, confirming that operational control had been formally elevated beyond ground authority. Mia Collins continued to monitor the evolving data stream, now observing that the system had expanded its analysis to include cross-reference behavioral patterns across multiple prior incidents linked to identity verification disputes within the airline network. This meant the current situation was no longer being assessed in isolation, but as part of a larger institutional review framework. Charles Whitmore, still seated within the VIP section, had shifted his posture slightly as the overhead display began to show live governance status indicators that were not previously accessible to passengers, reflecting a structured escalation from operational review to executive-level oversight. Marcus Carter remained in the same position, his presence steady, as the environment around him continued to adjust in response to system-level interpretation rather than human instruction. A new directive appeared across the internal operations channel stating that all boarding activity within the current zone was now subject to real-time executive governance validation, requiring full audit trace completion before any further procedural actions could resume. Nicole attempted to initiate contact with ground operations leadership, but her communication was automatically intercepted and redirected to a compliance acknowledgement interface, confirming that her authorization tier had been temporarily revoked pending final review determination. That confirmation effectively removed any remaining operational ambiguity, leaving only observation without intervention. Captain Reeves lowered his hands from the terminal interface, acknowledging without words that further attempts to regain control would be functionally irrelevant under the current system state. Mia quietly pointed out that the audit sequence was now reconstructing decision dependency chains, mapping how each action taken by staff contributed to the escalation path currently being evaluated. This level of analysis suggested that the system was not only recording what had happened, but also assessing why each decision was made and whether it aligned with corporate governance expectations. The boarding display then updated again, confirming full synchronization with executive oversight channels and indicating that all pending actions had been frozen until final authorization release. The lounge remained physically unchanged, yet operationally it had become a closed evaluation environment where every recorded decision was being measured against institutional accountability standards. Nicole stood in silence, no longer attempting further input, while Captain Reeves maintained distance from all control interfaces, both now fully aware that authority had shifted entirely away from procedural hierarchy and into a centralized review system that was actively determining the outcome of the situation in real time. Now the executive governance system had now reached the enforcement phase of its evaluation cycle, where all prior actions within the boarding lounge were no longer being analyzed for understanding alone, but for direct operational consequence mapping. Across every active terminal, access permissions began to update simultaneously, reflecting a synchronized decision release from corporate oversight channels that had remained silent until final validation was complete. Nicole Harris remained frozen near the boarding counter, her eyes fixed on the interface that no longer responded to any command she issued, as each attempt to reinitiate control resulted in immediate system denial accompanied by confirmation that her access tier had been fully suspended pending disciplinary review. Captain David Reeves stood slightly behind her, no longer attempting to interact with any terminal, as the realization set in that the authority structure he had operated under was no longer recognized within the current system state. Mia Collins watched the live audit feed as it transitioned from observation mode into enforcement output, where decision outcomes were beginning to generate automatic administrative actions tied directly to personnel roles involved in the sequence. The system interface displayed a new directive indicating that all operational privileges associated with the current crew assignment had been temporarily revoked pending final governance determination. This included boarding authority, manifest control, and communication privileges across the entire gate section. Charles Whitmore, still seated within the VIP area, observed the change in atmosphere as passengers began noticing that crew members were no longer issuing instructions, but were instead receiving system notifications that they did not appear to control. Marcus Carter remained in the same position, his presence unchanged, while the environment around him transitioned from evaluation to resolution phase within the corporate oversight framework. A new confirmation message appeared across all internal displays stating that executive-level audit findings had been validated and that corrective administrative actions were now being executed in accordance with compliance policy standards. Nicole finally lowered her hands completely from the terminal interface, no longer attempting input, as her access panel displayed a final status update confirming suspension of all operational credentials tied to active duty assignment. Captain Reeves received the same notification across his device, indicating that command authority for the current boarding sequence had been reassigned to Corporate Governance Execution Protocol, effectively ending all ground-level control over the situation. Mia quietly observed as system logs began updating in real time, showing role-based status changes being applied across the entire crew structure associated with the gate operation. The display confirmed removal of active permissions, transition to review status, and formal entry into disciplinary processing workflow for all affected personnel. The boarding lounge itself remained physically unchanged, but functionally it had been reclassified as a closed compliance environment where no further manual intervention was permitted until the governance cycle reached completion. Marcus remained still as the final stages of the audit sequence stabilized into a locked state, indicating that all collected data had been successfully processed and verified against executive authorization standards. The system interface then displayed a final pre-resolution status indicator confirming that all operational discrepancies had been resolved at governance level and that enforcement outcomes were ready for execution. In that moment, the entire structure of authority within the lounge had fully shifted from human decision-making to system-validated consequence execution, leaving only confirmation, observation, and irreversible administrative closure. Now the final stage of the governance execution cycle initiated without any physical intervention, as the executive compliance system transitioned from audit confirmation into finalized administrative enforcement across all connected operational channels. Every terminal within the boarding lounge displayed a unified status indicator confirming that the review process had reached completion and that all decisions previously marked as pending had now been resolved under corporate authority protocol. Nicole Harris received a final system notification indicating immediate termination of active duty assignment, along with permanent revocation of access credentials associated with boarding control operations and passenger verification systems. Captain David Reeves experienced the same transition across his command interface, where flight-level authority was formally reassigned to centralized governance control, rendering local operational hierarchy inactive for the remainder of the cycle. Neither attempted further input, as all available interfaces had already shifted into read-only status, preventing any modification or reversal of the recorded outcome. Mia Collins observed the final audit summary populate across her device, showing a complete reconstruction of the incident timeline, including every decision point, override attempt, and verification conflict that had occurred since Marcus Carter entered the VIP boarding area. The summary indicated that all actions had been evaluated against corporate compliance standards and that final enforcement alignment had been executed in accordance with executive governance policy. Across the lounge, passengers remained seated but visibly aware that the structure of authority had fundamentally changed, as crew members no longer issued instructions and instead stood in acknowledgement of system-level finalization. Charles Whitmore remained in the VIP seating area, now observing the absence of procedural activity as boarding operations were formally suspended pending system reset authorization from headquarters. Marcus Carter remained in place, his presence unchanged, as the environment around him stabilized into post-execution silence, where no further operational decisions were being generated by local staff or terminals. A final notification appeared across all displays confirming that the audit cycle had been fully closed and that enforcement actions had been successfully applied to all identified roles involved in the procedural breach review. Nicole and Captain Reeves both received synchronized confirmation messages indicating the conclusion of their active system association with the flight operation, marking the end of their operational control within the airline network. Mia slowly lowered her device as the system feed transitioned from active monitoring to archival storage, preserving the entire sequence as a permanent governance record accessible only through executive authorization. The boarding lounge, once filled with procedural movement and layered authority interactions, now existed in a state of complete operational stillness, defined only by resolved status indicators and inactive control interfaces. Marcus finally stepped forward toward the gate display, where his status remained confirmed under executive clearance with full system validation complete. He did not issue further commands, as none were required, and the system no longer awaited input. In that final moment, the entire sequence concluded not through confrontation, but through administrative completion, leaving